Donald Trump recently made a tweet saying Canada does not allow American banks to do business here, but Canadian banks are all over the US market. Now, if you read that, you'll probably think, wait, is it true? Is Canada not being fair with Americans? Well, here's the thing. This is one of those claims that sound dramatic, but once you actually understand how banking regulation works, it's a little more, let's say, complicated. So today we are going to break it all down into simple terms. We'll talk about how Canadian banking system works, what are the rules for foreign banks, including the US ones, and whether Trump's claim actually hold up. If you stick around till the end of this video, you might just walk away knowing more about banking than more politicians do. So let's start with a basic. If you are an American bank, let's say JP Morgan or Citibank, can you operate in Canada? The short answer is yes, but with some conditions. Canada does not ban US banks, that's a complete myth, but it does have specific rules about how foreign banks can operate here, and those rules are pretty strict. And trust me, these are here for a reason. See, Canada has the one of the most stable banking system in the entire world. It did not even just crash during the 2008 financial crisis when the American banks were struggling.
Financial crisis.
And the biggest part of that is because of how Canada regulates its banks. So let's talk about main things that stop US banks from just opening the branches all over the Canada. And that is the Bank Act. Canada has three types of banks under this law: class 1, 2, and 3. Class 1 is for domestic banks. These banks are Canadian hold banks like RBC, TD, and Scotia, which has full access, full control, and super strict government oversight. Class 2 is for foreign bank subsidiaries. This is how some US banks operate here in Canada. They have to set up a separate Canadian company that follow Canadian banking rules. So for example, Citibank of Canada is actually a Canadian company even though its parent is in US. Class 3, which is more important, that is foreign bank branches. These are limited in operations where the US banks can only offer business services, corporate lending, and investment banking, but they cannot open the checking accounts or savings account and take the deposits from everyday Canadian. And that is a big difference. So, yes, US banks can operate in Canada, but they cannot just open full service branches like they do back home. Why? Because Canadian banking laws prioritize financial security over competition. So let's say JP Morgan wants to open bunch of branches in Toronto and start offering savings accounts to Canadians. Why they cannot just do that? Well, for starters, Canada has a very strict banking regulations that required any bank taking deposit to hold a huge amount of capital in reserves. This prevents banks from collapse and financial crises. US banks don't want to deal with that because, well, that's a lot of money just sitting there instead of making profit. Another thing is Canadian regulators do not want the foreign banks to operate in a way that could destabilize the economy. That's why foreign banks cannot just came in and set up bunch of shops unless they follow the strict Canadian rules, not just their own rules. And that's not just to protect Canadian banks. It's about protecting Canadian consumers from risky banking practices that caused the 2008 crash. So let's say JP Morgan wants to open bunch of branches in Toronto and start offering the savings account to Canadians. Why they cannot just do that? Well, for starters, Canada has a very strict banking regulations that required any bank taking a deposit to hold a huge amount of capital in reserve. This prevent bank collapse and financial crisis. US banks do not want to deal with that because, well, let's say it's a lot of money just sitting there instead of making profit. Another thing, Canadian regulators do not want foreign banks to operate in a way that could destabilize the Canadian economy. That is why foreign banks cannot just came in and set up shops unless they follow Canadian rules, not just their own rules. And that is not just about protecting the Canadian banks, it's about protecting the Canadian consumers from risky banking practices that caused 2008 crash. But wait, what about the Canadian banks in the US? Now, here where the things get interesting. Trump said Canadian banks flood the US market, but do they? Let's find out. Canadian banks do operate in USA, yes, but here's the key difference. They don't just open bunch of branches from scratch. Instead, They buy the existing US banks. Smart, right? For example, TD Bank bought the Commerce Bank and become one of the biggest retail US bank. BMO, Bank of Montreal, own the Harris Bank in the US. RBC is also expanding its US operations for years now. So it's not like Canadians are bending the rules. These banks play by US law. They just use acquisition instead of opening bunch of branches from the scratch. And the US allows this because its banking system is more open to foreign ownership, but not Canada. Is this an unfair trade practice? Look, at the end of the day, this isn't about trade war or Canada blocking the competition. It's about financial security and how different countries regulate their banking systems. Canada keep foreign banks in check to protect its economy while the US is more open to foreign players. So, Trump claim is kind of misleading. US banks aren't banned in Canada. They just have to follow the same tough rules that Canadian banks do. And Canadian banks in the USA, they are playing by the same rules as of American banks. It isn't about Canada versus America thing. It's just a different banking policy. So what do you think? Should Canada loosen its banking restrictions and let the US banks operate more freely in Canada? Or do you think these rules are actually here to keep our financial system strong? Drop me a comment below and I love to hear your thoughts. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you like, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more deep dive into the stuff that really matters. See you in the next one. Peace out.